It's clear from your titles you're interested in Mars, and I always like to start these interviews asking, how did you get interested in this topic, and what was it that drew you to it? How old were you, and was this a childhood fascination, late blooming? Let us know how you got into Mars.
Well, the first is how I got into space, and that was Sputnik.
Okay.
Okay, I was 5 when Sputnik flew, and I was an early reader. I was already reading science fiction, and while the adults may have been in a frenzy about Sputnik, I was delighted because it meant all these stories about the spacefaring future were going to be true, and I wanted to be part of it. And my parents encouraged my interest. My father got me a telescope. I did drawings of the moon through the eyepiece. I got into model rocketry. I started reading all the books about space that I could get my hands on. And it rapidly became clear to me, certainly by the time I was 9 or 10, that Mars was the most interesting planet. It was the planet that was most Earth-like. Now, of course, at that time, people had an exaggerated view of the hospitality of Mars to life. The canals had not quite gone away, and even when they had, people kind of said the changing colors could be lichens and so forth. But even so, it was clear to me that life was the most scientifically interesting because it could have life on it, and it was the most promising for human settlement. So here we go. It's the 60s. And we're going to the moon by 1970, Mars by 1980, Saturn by 1990, Alpha Centauri by the year 2000. This is the program. I'm all in. Okay. Now, of course, as you know, the only part of that program that was realized, in fact, was the moon by 1970. In fact, we did it before then, 69. And the Nixon administration aborted the push. NASA had plans to land humans on Mars by 81, but that was not allowed to happen. And I was somewhat discouraged by that. By then, I was in college in the early 70s. And, I'm the first generation in my family to go to college. So for someone like that, the notion of you're going to college so you can get a good job afterwards, like that, okay? And so the idea of grad school didn't even occur to me, okay? It wasn't in the cards. And, gee, get real here, Robert. It's all fine to think you're going to be a space explorer when you're 12, but now you're an adult, you got to have a trade. So I knew a lot of science. I became a science teacher. And I did that for about 7 years. So there I am living in northern Manhattan and teaching in Brooklyn and taking the A train each way, an hour and 15 minutes each way, and reading novels by Herman Melville about sailing the South Seas and saying, what am I doing here? Okay. And by this time, I had realized there was this thing called grad school and you could become an engineer. So I applied and I got in to University of Washington in Seattle. Now, at that time, now we're talking the early 80s, I believe the most important thing that's going to happen in technology in the remaining part of the 20th century was fusion power. So I majored in nuclear engineering, and I'm doing that. And I also, though, started taking aerospace courses on the side because I was interested in that. And then I heard about this group called the Mars Underground, which was holding meetings in Boulder. And these people of my own generation, people like Chris McKay, Carol Stoker, Penelope Boston, very much just about my age, and very much the Apollo's children who had been betrayed by the failure to continue it. And they were saying, let's put Mars back on the agenda. So I went to the third Case for Mars conference, which was 87, and Carl Sagan spoke there. And by then they had attracted some pretty prestigious people, Thomas Paine, people like that. And wow, okay, so this is great. And also by this time, the fusion program, which I had a very good knowledge of because my PhD advisor was in an elite position within it, and he knew about what the funding decisions were going to be this year, next year, and it wasn't looking good, okay? And but meantime, while the scope of the fusion program was narrowing, here was this multifaceted problem involving everything from trajectories, propulsion, life support, science exploration. It was a very interesting design problem. And of course, it was like the war horse hearing the trumpet, I was drawn back. Okay. And so at the 87 conference, I made contact with Ben Clark, who you may or may not know, but he was leading the human Mars mission studies at Martin Marietta, which later became Lockheed Martin. And I went up to him, and I had this strong background in both nuclear and aerospace engineering. And he said, send me your resume. And I did. And a year later, I was working at Martin doing preliminary design of interplanetary missions. And it was a couple of years after that I came up with the Mars Direct plan, which made me prominent within the aerospace community. And there you have it.
I'm fascinated with that because I remember the Mars Underground, and the title was appropriate because you kind of had to be underground, didn't you? I mean, it wasn't appropriate at that time or on the radar of policymakers to really be thinking about that. Am I right?
Yes, and in fact, to tell you a little story, around 1982, when I was still a science teacher in New York, I heard the American Chemical Society was having its conference in Manhattan. And one of the speakers was Hans Mark, who was the deputy administrator of NASA. And there was a panel of like astronauts and then him. And he got up and he gave this speech. He said, look, we got the shuttle flying, and now we're going to do the shuttle, and we're going to have reconnaissance satellites and weather satellites, and they'll all be launched much cheaper because the shuttle is a reusable launch vehicle, and this is what's going to happen. And so I got up with this mic on the floor, and I said, what about humans to Mars? Why aren't we supposed to go to Mars? And he basically said, well, those were the dreams of youth. But now we've gotten realistic, and we understand that space is for important commercial purposes and so forth. And then he was interrupted by a female astronaut who was on the panel, who was Judith Resnick.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And she said, no, okay, you're right. But if you want to make it happen, you've got to make it happen. Okay. There you have it. So, of course, Judith Resnick was killed on the Challenger. But there you go. But I actually didn't start working on making it happen until I joined the Mars Underground, which was a few years after that. But still, I can remember that. It was
Is it fair to say that had an impact? And
yeah, it did. And, I was coming from exactly the same place that the other Mars Underground people were coming from, which is, weren't we supposed to go to Mars by now? Yeah. Okay. What happened to the Visionary space program? And indeed, we were supposed to go to Mars by the 80s. And, what Nixon had done in canceling it was like, Columbus comes back from the New World, and Ferdinand and Isabella say, so what? Who cares about this? That's more or less what had happened. And so what and here I'm grouping myself with the Mars Underground, although they actually started in on this before I did, wanted to do was correct this mistake.
Yeah.